Growing up, my life revolved around the family diner, a cozy little establishment in a bustling small town. My parents poured their hearts into that place, and I inherited their work ethic and commitment to community. It was there, among the clatter of dishes and the murmur of regular customers, that I learned what hard work really meant. But life had other plans, and my journey took me away from the diner and into Thomas's arms. I remember when I first met Thomas, he was charismatic and seemed like the embodiment of all my dreams. We married young, filled with hope and dreams of a shared future. In those early days, he would often help out at the diner, charming everyone with his easy smile and helping hand. My father thought the world of him, and when he fell ill, it was Thomas who promised him that he would take care of me. That promise feels hollow now. Over the years, the man I thought I knew has faded away, replaced by someone selfish and cold. His transgressions grew over time, each one chipping away at the foundation of our marriage. His affair, his financial irresponsibility, and now, his cruel words. "Stop leeching off me," he had said, as if my decades of support and partnership meant nothing. As I stood in our living room, the room where we had celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, and many quiet, everyday moments, I felt the final threads of my affection for Thomas snap. The realization hit me hard: this was no longer the man I had married. He had not only broken his vows, but the very promise he made to my father. He saw me as a burden, not as his partner. The weight of his betrayal was suffocating. But in that suffocation, a spark of resolve ignited within me. I wasn't just a housewife, I wasn't a bystander in my own life. I was Mila Smith, a woman who had run a diner, who had raised a son, who had weathered countless storms. Ryan, our son, was now an independent adult, and there was nothing tying me down to this man who saw my love as leeching. I lifted my head, meeting Thomas's gaze with a newfound strength. My voice, when I finally spoke, was steady and clear. The conversation we were about to have would not be pleasant, but it was necessary. I was ready to reclaim my life, to pursue my interests and passions without the shadow of his disdain looming over me. The man in front of me was a stranger now, but I would face him with the courage I had learned in the family diner, surrounded by loved ones who truly valued me. Reflecting on those days, the weight of the past and its ironies hit me as I stood facing the man I once believed to be my savior. Thomas had approached me under the guise of a light-hearted flirtation, a gesture supposedly wrapped in good intentions. His charming demeanor and his connection to the man who had saved our family diner seemed like a harbinger of better times. Yet, standing there in his presence now, I realized just how twisted that initial interaction had been. Back then, under the soft glow of gratitude and youthful naivete, I saw Thomas's proposal as flattering, even bold. It was a sunny afternoon when he had first sidled up to me, right outside the diner. My father and his father were inside, sharing a handshake over the resolved debt. The hum of a busy lunch service faded behind me as Thomas leaned in, his voice a low murmur against the backdrop of bustling streets. "You're pretty. How about going out with me sometime? Think of it as thanks for the loan," he had said, his smile smooth and confident. At first, I laughed it off, flattered but uncertain. I appreciated his family's help, but I was not a naive girl who believed in fairy tales spun by handsome princes. But then, his tone shifted, a dark undercurrent beneath his charming facade. "Don't be ungrateful, diner girl," he whispered, a veiled threat lacing his words. At the time, I didn't fully grasp the manipulation embedded in that interaction. I rationalized it as awkward flirting, deciding to give him a chance, attributing his odd comment to clumsy attempt at humor. But it wasn't humor, it was control. And that control had only tightened over the years. Now, as I faced Thomas in the fading light of our marriage, his earlier words echoed through the years, a stark reminder of the subtle coercions that had threaded through our relationship. He had never seen me as an equal partner, but rather as someone to be kept under thumb, someone who owed him for a kindness that was never freely given. That realization stung with a clarity that was almost brutal. The man who had once pretended to be my knight was actually the architect of my confinement. Our marriage, built on a foundation of indebtedness and obligation, was a farce. As these truths crystallized, my resolve hardened. The young woman who had once stood nervously outside her family diner, unsure and swayed by a handsome face and a perceived obligation, was no more. In her place was a woman forged by years of silent battles and unspoken sacrifices, a woman ready to reclaim her life and her dignity. "I am not your debtor, Thomas, nor your property," I said firmly, the strength of my own voice surprising me. "I am Mila Smith, and I owe you nothing." The room felt charged with the shift in power as I spoke. It was not just the end of our marriage that loomed, it was the beginning of my emancipation. The years of manipulation and control were coming to an end, and though the path forward was uncertain, it was mine to shape. Despite my growing suspicions, I was trapped in a cycle of doubt and silence. Thomas's unpredictable hours and evasive answers left me anxious and isolated. The young woman who had once managed a busy diner, confident and clear-headed, found herself second-guessing every instinct. It was as if the vibrant life I had led before Thomas was a distant memory, overshadowed by the unease that now filled my days. My reluctance to confront Thomas wasn't just about fear of his temper, it was also about not wanting to disrupt the fragile peace of our home. The potential repercussions of accusing him of infidelity weighed heavily on me. What if he retaliated? What if he spread rumors or lies that could hurt not just me, but my father and the diner's reputation? These thoughts haunted me, feeding into my decision to keep quiet. The decision to go out with Thomas that first time, despite my initial reservations, was influenced by more than just the threat of rumors. There was a genuine connection, or so I believed at the time. He was charismatic, knew the right places to go, and seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. That first date, surprisingly enjoyable, led me to reconsider my first impression of him. Maybe he wasn't just a threat, maybe he could be a partner, a thought that now felt naive. As our relationship progressed, Thomas's words, "Being with you is fun, Mila. I'd consider marrying a good, serious girl like you," swirled around in my mind, sweeping me off my feet. His proposal came as a culmination of what I thought were genuine feelings, and I eagerly accepted, envisioning a future filled with love and partnership. It was a decision made in the flush of romance, without recognizing the manipulation that lurked beneath his affections. After the wedding, the reality of our marriage began to unfold in stark contrast to the courtship. Thomas handed me his handwritten pay stubs each month, a practice that seemed quaint at the time but soon became a symbol of his control. He deposited his salary directly into the bank, leaving me with just a slip of paper and a modest sum to manage our household. It felt like a leash, keeping me bound to the financial breadcrumbs he chose to leave. His routine became a source of constant anxiety for me. Thomas would leave early, his return always uncertain, citing his busy schedule as his father's successor. "Stop nagging, fine, I'll call," he would snap whenever I asked for just a bit of consideration. His dismissive attitude only compounded my unease, making me feel like an afterthought in his life. Amidst these tensions, I couldn't help but wonder about his activities outside our home. Was he really burdened with work, or was he indulging in other pursuits? The thought of an affair crossed my mind more than once, but fear of confrontation, of the loud, dismissive arguments, kept me from voicing my suspicions. I was caught between the fear of what I might discover and the diminishing hope that things could improve. This silence became my shield and my prison, as I navigated the daily uncertainties of a marriage built on deception and manipulation. The news of my father-in-law's hospitalization came as a stark reminder of the promises I had made, not just to Thomas, but to his father as well. As serious as his condition was, I felt bound by an old promise to support Thomas, to remain the dutiful wife in the eyes of his father, despite everything that had transpired between us. The complexity of my emotions was overwhelming. On one hand, I was preparing to end my marriage, while on the other, I felt compelled to honor a commitment made long ago under very different circumstances. Life, it seemed, was pulling me in multiple directions. My sense of duty was clashing with my desire for freedom and self-respect. As I sat in the hospital, watching my father-in-law lying frail and weak, I couldn't help but reflect on the irony of it all. Here was a man who, despite his son's failings, believed in the sanctity of marriage and family. And here was I, his daughter-in-law, contemplating divorce as a means to salvage what remained of my own dignity. The hospital's sterile, quiet corridors became a place of reflection for me. My visits were often long and filled with silent contemplations. It was during one of these visits that I realized how detached Thomas had become, not only from me but also from his own father. His visits were infrequent, and when he did show up, they were brief and perfunctory. The contrast between his indifference and my own conflicted presence was stark. I remember sitting beside the old man, holding his hand, thinking about the vows I had made to him on my wedding day. I had promised to take care of his son, to be a faithful wife, but those promises were based on a vision of marriage that had long since dissolved into something unrecognizable. It was during one of those quiet moments that I made a decision. I couldn't let my life be dictated by the expectations of others, not even those of a dying man. But the decision to divorce, although clear in my mind, was not simple to enact. The logistics of separating a life built together over decades, the fear of the unknown, and the potential fallout with my son, Ryan, weighed heavily on me. However, my resolve was strengthened by the memory of my own father's encouragement to always stand up for myself, to be true to who I was. So, I began to prepare in earnest. I started gathering financial documents, seeking legal advice, and quietly setting aside resources that would allow me to start anew. I knew the road ahead would be challenging, but the thought of reclaiming my identity and independence brought me a sense of peace that had been absent for years. As I navigated this preparation phase, I couldn't help but reflect on the cycle of my marriage, how it began with a promise and was ending with me fulfilling a different kind of promise to myself. The illusion of our happy times before marriage had indeed vanished, but in its place, a new hope was slowly taking shape, a hope for a future where I could be true to myself, free from the shadows of manipulation and neglect. It's about doing what's necessary for my own well-being. As I mulled over these thoughts, a mix of determination and apprehension filled me. I needed to find the perfect moment to discuss the divorce, a time that wouldn't create unnecessary chaos or hurt anyone more than necessary. It felt almost like trying to find the right moment to bandage a wound that had been left open for too long. I considered the logistics, the emotional fallout, and the timing. The house was quieter now, with Ryan starting his new life in New York, which meant fewer interruptions and more space to think and plan. The emptiness of the house mirrored the emptiness I felt in my marriage. It was both liberating and lonely, providing a stark canvas against which my next actions would be painted. Thomas's visits home had become so infrequent that each one seemed like it might be an opportunity to bring up the topic. But each time he came home, he seemed more distant, more detached from the domestic life we once shared. His focus was entirely on his role at the company, a position he had taken over from his father, seemingly indifferent to anything that didn't directly affect his work. During one of these rare evenings, when he was home, I sat at the dinner table, rehearsing the words in my mind. I observed him across the table, his face buried in his phone, barely acknowledging the meal I had prepared. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was customary, a testament to the vast gulf that had grown between us. "Thomas, we need to talk," I finally said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside me. He looked up, irritation flickering across his features, before he masked it with a neutral expression. "What is it now?" he asked, his tone dismissive. "It's about us, about our marriage. I think it's time we considered a divorce." The words felt surreal, even as they hung in the air between us. Thomas's reaction was a mix of surprise and annoyance. "Divorce? Why now?" Ryan settled, "And everything is going smoothly." "Smoothly for whom?" I countered. "You're hardly ever home, and when you are, we're like strangers. We've been living separate lives under the same roof, Thomas. I don't think either of us is truly happy this way." He sighed, putting down his phone and finally looking at me directly. "Is this what you really want?" "Yes, it's what I've needed for a long time. I prepared everything already. I just needed the right moment to say it." The conversation that followed was long and fraught with tension. Thomas tried to argue, to convince me to reconsider, citing financial complications and the impact on our social standing. But my mind was made up. I was resolute, fortified by years of silent endurance and the newfound resolve from seeing Ryan pursue his own happiness. In the end, Thomas agreed to the divorce, albeit reluctantly. We decided to keep it as amicable as possible, for the sake of our past and the family we once were. As difficult as it was to initiate this conversation, it was a necessary step towards reclaiming my life, a life where I could finally breathe freely, unencumbered by the weight of a loveless marriage. The decision brought a mix of sadness and relief, but above all, it brought a sense of hopeful anticipation for the future. "For your things, I got rid of everything," Thomas called out coldly from the living room, his voice echoing through the empty corridors of what used to be our shared home. Stunned, I stood in the threshold of our bedroom, or rather, the shell of it. The room felt alien, stripped of its warmth and familiarity. My heart sank as the reality set in. Not only had Thomas decided to end our relationship in the most brutal way possible, but he had also erased every trace of my existence from our home. It was a clear message: I was no longer welcome here. I felt a mixture of rage and despair boiling inside me. "How could you do this?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling with emotion. "After everything we've been through together, how could you just throw me out like this?" Thomas appeared in the doorway, his expression one of annoyance rather than remorse. "Look, Mila, I've made up my mind. It's better for both of us this way. You need to start your own life now, away from here," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. The coldness in his words cut deeper than the loss of my personal belongings. It wasn't just about the material items, though their absence was a shock, it was about what their removal represented. It was the erasure of years of life, love, and struggle. It was the final, undeniable proof of how little he valued me and our time together. I knew arguing was futile. Thomas had made his decision, and his actions spoke louder than any words could. The man I had once loved was gone, replaced by someone who saw me as nothing more than an inconvenience. With nothing left for me in what was once our home, I turned to leave. The future was uncertain and frightening without the security of my marriage and home. But as I stepped out into the cool air of the evening, a strange sense of relief began to wash over me. The ties that had bound me, however painful their severance, were now cut. I was free to rebuild, free to find a place where I was valued and seen, not as a burden, but as a person. As I walked away from the house, the realization that I had nothing but the clothes on my back felt both terrifying and liberating. The road ahead would be difficult, but it was mine to shape. For the first time in years, despite the shock and pain, a spark of hope flickered within me. I was on my own now, but that meant I could finally start living for myself. Thomas's accusations were ludicrous, but not unexpected. His voice was laced with the same entitled anger that had characterized so many of our past conversations. "You stole it. You must have taken the money out." "I haven't touched your money, Thomas," I replied, keeping my tone even despite the rising irritation. "The account is empty because you never deposited enough to cover the expenses like you claimed. Your father's hospital bills, our living costs, you promised to handle them, remember?" His silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. It was a familiar pattern, Thomas making commitments he had no intention of keeping, then twisting the narrative when confronted with his failings. "You need to sort this out, Thomas. It's your responsibility," I continued, my voice firm. "I'm no longer in a position to manage these things for you. You decided that when you threw me out. But you—" "No, Thomas," I cut him off, my patience wearing thin. "I won't be dragged back into your mess. You've made your bed, now lie in it." The conversation ended with Thomas hanging up in a huff, a mix of frustration and resignation in his tone. I sighed, turning my attention back to the plate of food in front of me. The hotel restaurant was quiet, a stark contrast to the turmoil of my personal life. Despite the upheaval, I felt a profound sense of relief. The distance from Thomas provided a clarity I hadn't realized I'd been missing. In the solitude of my temporary accommodations, I began laying the groundwork for my new life. The storage unit holding my belongings was a temporary solution, but it symbolized a fresh start. I had already begun looking for a small apartment in the area, something affordable yet comfortable, where I could establish myself away from the shadow of my former life with Thomas. As I planned, I also reflected on the financial implications of my new independence. Living in a hotel was indeed costly, and though the thought of billing Thomas for it was more a fleeting fantasy than a viable plan, it underscored the practical challenges ahead. My years as a housewife had not prepared me for the financial independence I now faced, but I was determined to navigate it with as much grace and savvy as I could muster. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed again. It was an email from a real estate agent about a viewing appointment for an apartment. A small smile crossed my lips as I read the details. This could be it, the next step in building a life that was truly my own. As I walked back to my room, the weight of the past few weeks seemed a little lighter. Yes, there were uncertainties and challenges ahead, but there was also hope, a chance to redefine my identity on my own terms, free from the oppressive dynamics of my marriage to Thomas. I turned to face him, a cool smile playing on my lips. This, Thomas, is where we'll be discussing our divorce. I thought it fitting to choose a neutral, yet appropriately grand setting for such an occasion. Thomas's eyes widened as he took in the opulent surroundings. You can't be serious. This mansion? Why here? Well, I thought it important to meet somewhere where neither of us would feel at an advantage. Plus, it's quite inspirational, don't you think? I gestured around us, taking in the sprawling garden and the stately facade of the mansion. It's a reminder of what one can achieve with honesty and integrity, something you might want to think about. His confusion was evident, but behind that, I could sense his fear escalating. Thomas had always been a man driven by appearances and the fear of losing face. By bringing him to such a lavish setting, I was playing into those insecurities, reminding him of the stakes at hand. As we walked toward the grand entrance, I continued, you mentioned you wanted a divorce and expected me to pay alimony. That's quite interesting, considering your hidden allowances and the discrepancies in what you've claimed to contribute. Thomas faltered, his stride breaking as he processed my words. Look, Mila, maybe we can discuss this. Discuss we will, Thomas. But on my terms this time. I opened the grand door, gesturing for him to enter first. The foyer was as grand as the exterior promised, with marble floors and a sweeping staircase. After all, isn't this what you wanted? A clean break and a fresh start? He nodded, still visibly shaken, as we moved into a lavishly decorated sitting room. I chose a chair facing the entrance, positioning myself with confidence. Now, let's talk about the divorce terms clearly and without interruptions. I have documented evidence of your financial discrepancies and your infidelity. It's in your best interest to settle this amicably. Thomas sank into the chair opposite me, his usual bravado gone. The realization that his usual tactics wouldn't work was dawning on him. He glanced around the room, as if looking for an escape, then met my gaze. What do you want, Mila? I want fairness, Thomas. I want what I'm due after years of supporting you, putting my own needs aside. We can resolve this here and now, or we can take it to court. Either way, I'm prepared. The tension in the room was palpable as he weighed his options. This was not just a discussion about dividing assets, it was a reckoning of years of manipulation and deceit. As I awaited his response, I felt empowered, knowing that I was finally taking control of my future, on my terms, in a setting that symbolized the life I intended to build for myself post-divorce. With a glimmer of realization in his eyes, he asked, So, you were preparing for this all along? Planning our divorce and building this house? Yes, Thomas, I was preparing, I confirmed, my voice steady and unyielding. I was preparing to ensure that once we parted ways, I would be secure, that I wouldn't have to depend on anyone, especially not someone who never truly valued me. Thomas looked around the room once more, his expression a mixture of awe and defeat. He had underestimated me for years, seeing me only as the dutiful wife, quietly existing in his shadow. Now, confronted with the reality of my independence and foresight, he seemed lost, his usual bravado evaporated. The truth, Thomas, is that I grew tired of waiting for you to see me as your equal, I continued, the weight of years of silence lifting with each word. So, I took matters into my own hands. I used my skills, learned new ones, and created a new path for myself. One that doesn't require me to be underappreciated or underestimated. As I spoke, my lawyer, who had been quietly observing the exchange, interjected, if we could return to the matter at hand. We have proposals to discuss regarding the terms of the divorce. Mila has been very clear about what she expects and what she is entitled to, especially considering the contributions she has made financially and emotionally over the years. Thomas, still reeling from the revelations, nodded slowly. He finally seemed to understand that the balance of power had shifted, that the woman he thought he knew was far more capable and deserving of respect than he had ever imagined. We spent the next hour discussing the specifics of the divorce, alimony, division of assets, and other details. I was firm but fair, driven not by vengeance, but by a desire for justice and equity. Thomas, for his part, seemed resigned, perhaps even a little respectful of the person I had become. By the time we concluded our discussion, the terms were set. Thomas agreed to the conditions, somewhat humbled by the ordeal and perhaps by the realization that he had lost not just a wife, but a partner who had stood by him, even from the shadows. As he left the grand house that symbolized my new beginning, there was no dramatic farewell, no bitter parting words. Instead, there was a simple acknowledgement, a nod that seemed to convey a mixture of regret and acknowledgement of my resilience. I watched him go, the closing door marking not just the end of our marriage, but the beginning of a new chapter in my life. One where I stood strong, independent, and free from the constraints of my past. As I turned back to the expansive living space, I felt a profound sense of peace. Here, in this place I had created, I was home. Thomas, red-faced and visibly shaking, stood before me, struggling to process the rapid downfall that had just unfolded in his life. His voice, once commanding and sure, now trembled with a mix of disbelief and rising panic. "You can't just end things like this, Mila. Not after everything." "I'm not ending anything abruptly, Thomas," I responded calmly, maintaining a composed demeanor despite the storm of emotion swirling around us. "This is the result of years of choices, each one building to this moment. You chose your actions, I'm merely ensuring that there are consequences." Thomas paced back and forth, running his hands through his hair, a gesture of frustration and confusion. "But to go to my father? To show him those photos?" That was low, Mila. You know how much he valued integrity in the business. "It was necessary," I replied firmly. "Your father deserved to know who he was entrusting his company to. The integrity of the business was at stake, not just our personal issues." He stopped pacing and looked at me, his eyes searching for some sign of the partner he once knew. "Was there no other way? Did you have to destroy my career along with our marriage?" "Thomas, think about the choices you made," I said, my voice steady. "Your affair, the secrets, the financial deceit, they weren't just personal failings, they affected everyone around you, including your employees and family. I didn't destroy your career, you jeopardized it yourself through your actions." He shook his head, seemingly trying to reject the reality before him. "And what now, Mila? What do you gain from all this?" "I gain nothing but the peace of knowing I no longer have to live with deceit," I answered. "And I hope, eventually, you'll gain insight into your own behavior and perhaps find a way to rebuild and move forward more thoughtfully." Thomas looked defeated, the fight draining out of him as he absorbed the weight of the situation. "I suppose there's no turning back now. You've made your point very clear." "Yes, Thomas, it's clear," I affirmed. "And while this might be painful now, it's perhaps a necessary step towards something better for both of us. We can now go our separate ways honestly, without illusions." As he walked away, the finality of the moment settled around us like dust after a storm. I watched him disappear into the crowd, a part of me saddened by the necessity of our confrontation, but another part felt a profound relief. I had stood up for honesty and integrity, and while the cost was significant, it was justified. I turned away, ready to face my new life, one built on the hard lessons learned from the past. The road ahead would undoubtedly have its own challenges, but I felt equipped to meet them with a renewed sense of purpose and self-respect. The call from Ryan brought a smile to my face. It was refreshing, a lovely contrast to the heavy conversations and confrontations I'd been immersed in with Thomas and his family. Hearing about Ryan's relationship and his plans to bring his girlfriend over reminded me of the normalcy and simple joys of life that had been somewhat overshadowed by the recent events. As I hung up the phone, my thoughts shifted back to the recent upheaval with Thomas and the control of his father's company. It had been a whirlwind of strategy and emotion. When his father offered me the shares, it wasn't out of spite or an attempt to stir further discord within the family. It was a calculated move to safeguard the company from further harm due to Thomas's irresponsible actions. His father was deeply concerned about the stability and reputation of the company, and seeing his son's detrimental behavior must have been incredibly difficult. Acquiring the shares had put me in a position of unexpected power, a position I never truly wanted but accepted as a means to an end. When I transferred them to Thomas's brother and his wife, it was my way of stepping away from the potential chaos and ensuring that the company could be steered back onto a path of integrity and prosperity by people who genuinely cared for its future. Thomas's reaction to all of this had been pitiful. His pleas for forgiveness and his collapse were indicative of how little he understood about responsibility and consequences. His life up until that point had been a series of taking what he wanted without consideration for the effects on others. His dismissal from the company was a harsh but necessary lesson. Now, out of the corporate world and apparently working part-time at a convenience store, Thomas would have to face a reality he had never imagined. His previous lifestyle, filled with entitlement and disregard for others, was no longer sustainable. It was a tough reality check, and one he had to navigate without any support from me. My decision to stay detached was firm, rooted in the need to protect my own peace and focus on rebuilding my life. Turning my thoughts away from Thomas, I contemplated my own future. The divorce and all its accompanying drama had allowed me to reassess what I wanted out of life. Work was fulfilling, and I was enjoying the freedom to make decisions for myself without having to accommodate Thomas's whims or clean up his messes. The possibility of new love was on the horizon, not as a necessity, but as an option I could explore at my leisure. My colleagues were supportive, and among them, I sensed potential for something more, relationships built on mutual respect and shared interests, a stark contrast to what I had with Thomas. As I prepared for Ryan's visit with his girlfriend, I felt optimistic. I wanted him to have all the happiness and success and love that I hadn't found in my marriage. With the lessons I'd learned, I hoped to guide him subtly, ensuring he knew the value of respect, trust, and true partnership. Ryan seemed well prepared for life's challenges, much more so than I had been at his age. Watching him navigate his relationship would be a joy, not just as a mother, but as a woman who had come through the fire of adversity with a new appreciation for the simple, beautiful parts of life.